State of the Industry podcast. And here we go. This episode is brought to you by KP Movement Education, your source for health and movement education and coaching. Whether you are a health or fitness professional, a fitness consumer, or perhaps a passive bystander, KP believes that everyone deserves the right to pain-free movement. That's why their memberships and services are designed to educate, empower, and inspire you to create a culture of movement for yourself and those around you. With 2 membership options, you'll find education surrounding developing at-home training programs for yourself or for others, mental health and exercise, lifestyle medicine, and much, much more. Check it out at kineticperformance.ca/memberships. That's kineticperformance.ca/memberships. Hey, Fit Fam, welcome back to the State of the Industry podcast. I am your host, Adam Youngsma. In this episode, we bring you part 2 of my conversation with Michol Dalcourt. Michol is the CEO of the IOM, or the Institute of Motion. He is the inventor of the ViPR PRO and the co-founder of PTA Global. He has presented all over the world, and I have had the pleasure of hearing him speak on multiple occasions. And really the motto of the IOM is stay curious, and I have really taken that to heart, and that is one of the driving forces of what I do and why we have this podcast, is because I'm constantly wanting answers to questions that I have and wanting to bring all this information to you. And so if you haven't heard part number 1 of my conversation with Michol, I suggest that you go back and listen to the previous episode. But either way, here is part number 2. Enjoy. Welcome back, Michol. Really excited for this part number 2. So before we get into 4Q, because we kind of finished off talking about that, I was thinking a little bit earlier, actually, before we had our call, and I was thinking about training principles.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about when you look at different certifications, they have different training principles, and often the main ones are very similar. You got specificity, progressive overload, you've got all that stuff. Some of them have structural tolerance. I wonder if variability should now be one of those training principles when you're thinking about longevity, and when you're thinking about what most clients who the average personal trainer works with is general population, not an athlete, not necessarily a rehabilitation client, but they need the variability for specificity, because variability, as you mentioned in part number 1, is life. Like, that is what life is. And so having that, I think, as a training principle might be useful.
Yeah, no, we have a chapter in our course called Variability is Specificity, right? Which is an oxymoron, but it is. Right? Variability is specifically life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it is specifically life. That is variable. Like, play any contact sport, play any racket sport. I mean, you talked about how you love to play a variety. I mean, if we videotape you doing all those things, it is variable.
Yeah.
It is not chaos, but it is variable.
Yeah.
And to understand that that is what underscores the remodeling of our body, what underscores health markers to a certain degree, to a large degree. That to us, we're a health and human performance company.
Yeah.
And so what we look at is we look at health and human performance.
Yeah.
Right. And so we look at, all right, if I'm loading and I'm doing certain things from a performance standpoint, does that also equal health and sustainability?
Yeah.
And if the answer is no, well, that's okay as long as we know it, because then we're overreaching, right? So, think of the female population that live in Boulder, Colorado. So if I'm an endurance athlete, and this happens to males too, but it's more demonstrative in the female gender, which is this idea that I'm doing these ultra distance, high demand, high volume stress bouts of either triathlon or running. And so I'm pushing the volume, pushing my training. And then as a result, that stress starts to conflict or interfere with the natural functions or the undulations of my chemistry, i.e. the menstrual cycle, right? And so now I'm amenorrheic, and so I'm world-class fit, right? I'm on the podiums. But if I haven't had my period in 3 years, then I'm not healthy.
Yeah.
So there is a disconnect between, performance and health.
Yeah.
And again, it affects males all the time as well. But that to me is such a demonstrative kind of example because now I'm missing some of those things. Another example could be, high intensity exercise is great at eliciting all sorts of performance markers and, certain things in relation to health too. But one of the things that it does do is increase acidosis. It increases myokines like interleukin 6. And interleukin 6 is immunosuppressing.
Yeah.
So then what, right? So then am I doing my dose response of high intensity enough that I'm blunting my immune response? And if so, how does that affect my longevity, right? And so these are the types of questions that we ponder all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. So going along with that, when you or your team, when you come across a new concept, a new, I guess, way of thinking, like you guys are pretty forward thinking, you're pretty ahead of the curve in a lot of what you're doing. When you read a journal article, somebody else says something, maybe you went to a conference session, what do you do when you get that information? What's kind of your process with kind of hearing about it and then actually putting that into practice, either in a course that you're designing or a conference session or something like that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. First, when in our process, we've got a bunch of academics on our staff. So we have 4 PhDs that are, and that their job is basically to, cite, to reveal, to make sense of the research that is out there, the peer-reviewed evidence that is out there, and that's great. And so when we do is when we look at this, a couple things. We keep an open mind, which sometimes is challenging, right? Because we're fraught with our own ideologies and our own biases of things.
Yeah.
We try to keep an open mind, and then our tagline is "Stay curious," right? So knowing who we are, like we're not a research company. We are an applied health and human performance company, which means that we apply things.
Yeah.
And so in taking that theory, and then to your point, how do we convert it? Well, we keep an open mind, we stay curious, but then we look for what sort of things can we bring about. We see ourselves as almost like environmental engineers, right? We think environment dictates behavior. And that could be at the level of the cell, that could be me consciously behaving in a certain way. Environment dictates behavior. And so, what environments can I elicit to evoke what we know is going to be a certain pattern of behavior, tissue-wise, signaling, right? All those things. Yeah. Tissue behaviors or system behaviors, so that we can create an outcome that we want, right? And so that's typically the way we do it. So I'll give you an example. So we looked at, the mechanisms and the research around, core activation and core stability, et cetera. And we looked at the research on, let's say, motor patterning and the function of muscles. And when you look at those things and you look at the fact that muscles themselves are task-driven, right? So you said, the body knows best. Well, in a lot of cases, the body does know best. If I try to interfere with conscious means, I slow it down. But if I had you lean back far enough, right, your rectus abdominis would fire independent of what you think.
Yeah.
Even though we think that the rectus abdominis is a trunk flexor, if you lean back, it would fire. If you lean forward right now, how you are in relation to gravity, you lean forward, it would not fire.
Yeah.
It would relax and your rectus spinae would fire. And you'd say, wait a second, everything's backwards because I thought that was supposed to erect the spine, not flex the spine.
Yeah.
And in reality, all it's doing is decelerating gravity.
Yeah.
But that's not the action of the rectus abdominis until you lay down on your back. And so if muscles are task-driven, and we're looking at spinal segmental stability in this example for the core, we're looking at practical evidence or practical and applied solutions to that, right? So we would say, all right, muscles are task-driven, and we want deep core stabilization. Well, we know that the task of breathing is not just a muscle thing, but an orchestra of different muscle things. And what forces air out is not the same as what allows air to rush in, right? That's exhalation versus inhalation, right? So there are 2 different series of motor units and muscles that do that task. Mm-hmm. All of them are important to spinal segmental stability. right? So instead of just consciously trying to activate the glutes as a glute bridge, let's say as a warm up, and making assessments on that, like, you can't do that because you can't control it and your hamstrings are cramping.
Yeah.
A lot of people would take that view, and that's fine, but that's not our view. What we might look at is, that's cool if you can control it, but what if you can't? We always make inferences like, there's lack of motor control. Is there really?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if I said, hey, try to contract your multifidus muscles, which are little paraspinal muscles, or your intercostals right now, go, Adam, go ahead and flex those.
Yeah.
You'd be like, I'm a pretty good mover and I can't do that.
Yeah.
And so then what? Do I make the same assessment of you? Like, you can't control those muscles, therefore you do have lack of motor control. Mm-hmm. No, we just gave them the wrong task. And so what we do is we say, what is the right task? Well, it's a series of breathing out as much as you can. And then when you think you're done, you keep breathing out because you call upon accessory breathing muscles at that point. Yeah. Conversely, you breathe in, and when you think you're done, you keep going and try to breathe in a little bit more, and that calls upon accessory muscles. And we know that all of those, there's different muscles, but all of them in aggregate stabilize the trunk. So now we have a solution. Now we go, okay, we know the core, we know the science of the core, we know segmental stability, we know the mechanics of it. And now we know the mechanisms of try to get it done. So now we say, all right, now we know forced inhalation and forced exhalation are ways of deep core stabilization. Okay, so now can we change the position? So now we can, can we vary it, right? So now we're thinking, okay, if I take a golfer in the backswing, in that zone of transformation right here, I get them to either breathe out or in. Mm-hmm. I am going to call upon all those accessory muscles that stabilize my spine and my trunk and my shoulders in that specific position. Well, if that's a golfer and I'm doing that, I'm teaching the body to stabilize at that position, which then recognizes more stability and decreased threat. And as soon as I do it, my nervous system, let's say, owns that position now. Yeah. And when it does, I can generate force and get out of the way, because as soon as I generate force, there's an impulse of force production, which is, muscle contraction. And then there's zero threat or very little threat because I've trained it. My muscles can get out of the way, which means club head speed can, approach 120 or whatever I want it to be. Yeah. And so that would be the difference between understanding, the theory of core stability or breathing and then trying to apply it for folks. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's kind of what we do is we look at the theoretical mechanisms behind it, and I'm trying to understand it, and then trying to apply solutions to that understanding. Yeah. And we have a team, like 10 brains are better than one, right? So we typically have a team of individuals that bounce ideas off of. And I would actually recommend this to our fitness industry, because a lot of times our fitness industry is fraught with louder arguments and more bravado. Like, I'm going to put you down to elevate myself. And I would encourage all of us to not do that, right? Share best practices and keep an open mind that's not, like, sometimes try to subvert your own ideology. Mm-hmm. And if you can do that, right, which is a mental trick, right? Because it's cognitive dissonance, right? We're not going to go against what we truly believe, right? Yeah. But if you can do that for a time, if you can hold your beliefs at bay for a second and just try to challenge them, we will be surprised on where we arrive.
Yeah. I love that. Like, surround yourself with smart people, talk to other people, even like just observe other coaches, observe researchers or individuals who are specialists in their field, and just kind of listen, read. And I love, as you said, your kind of motto is stay curious. And I tell that, like, when I have PTs who come through a certification, I'm like, this is not over. This is foundation. And what you learned is good enough for right now, but you got to continually, like, every single day, trying to get, that 1%, trying to continue to push yourself and think outside the box and come with an open mind. Right. I think it was Mike Boyle once. I was listening to a session that he did at Perform Better. And he said he likes smart people. And I was like, yeah, okay, who doesn't like a smart person? But then he went through what his acronym of SMART is. And it was, they're willing to change their minds, they're, they come with an open mind. I can't remember what all of them were, but they ask questions, they come with an open mind, and they're willing to change their mind and have their mind changed, because with a lot of people. If you think about what you thought you knew even last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's changed drastically from what you originally thought. Like I remember when I started in this industry, and I think about 4 years in, I was actually teaching at a university at that time. And what I taught then, I would probably slap myself now. Like I would go back and slap myself and be like, what were you thinking? Right. But that's what we knew then. That's what I thought I knew then. And you don't know what you don't know, and you continue to learn. So,
and we're trying to learn something that's pretty complex, right?
yeah.
And it's not mechanistic in the sense that, just because you have different inputs coming in doesn't mean you have a different outcome coming out. Like people can survive on eating different, levels of macronutrients, and their body figures it out.
Yeah.
Right? People live in hot or cold. The body figures things out.
Yeah.
Or tries to, at least. And it may do that in a variety of different ways.
Yeah.
And that's difficult, because if we're trying to say this equals this, well, that's difficult in biology.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So let's get to 4Q. You started to explain it a little bit in part number 1. And what I wanted to get to is I was first introduced, as I mentioned, it's probably 4 or 5 years ago at Philex by Jan, who is one of your partners at IOM, and very, very smart man, puts a lot of good stuff out on social media with the ViPR PRO. And he was the first person who introduced me to the 4Q model. It's the first time I saw it. And he walked through just the movement one. So you've mentioned that you have a whole bunch of them, but can you just walk through the 4Q for movement specifically, and then we'll get into the metabolic one?
Sure. So as you said, we have 3 of them, but at a high level, 4Q is basically when you have 2 continuums that overlap. So if you've got let's say a y-axis going this way and an x-axis going this way, and you take those continuums and you overlap them, it's going to look like a plus sign or a cross if it's distributed a little higher. But there's going to be 4 quadrants. Mm-hmm. And again, those quadrants may not be equal in terms of size or consideration, but there are 4 distinct kind of quadrants made when you bisect, 2 continuums.
Yeah.
So the idea there is that it allows us to consider variability. Mm-hmm. Right. And so the movement one in your mind's eye, and these are pretty simple in concepts, but it can go deep in terms of, and we can go deep right here. But the idea is it's pretty simple in terms of, top level view.
Yeah.
So the movement one, imagine if you've got an x-axis, and on the upper end, you've got what we call loaded. So loaded is any type of external resistance that you're introducing to your body. Yeah. Right. And what that does is it amplifies, kind of the natural forces of that surround us, right?
Yeah.
So I might externally load my body with a weight vest, or a barbell, or a dumbbell, or a kettlebell, or a band, or a prowler, or the list goes on and on. So any type of external resistance that I apply to my body, that's what we call loaded.
Yeah.
On the other end, right, on the lower end of that y-axis, we would say it's what's called unloaded. Now, unloaded is our body weight in its environment, right? So that could be our body weight in gravity-ground reaction. It could be our body weight in water, right? But those are the natural forces of life.
Yeah.
And so if we introduce our bodies to that, it's body weight.
Mm-hmm.
So now you've got loaded and you've got body weight or unloaded. And by unloaded, we don't mean there's no force anymore. It just means there's no additional amplified force with any external means.
Yeah.
It's just our unloaded body, right? If that makes sense. So that's the kind of the y-axis going up now. The x-axis going left to right. On the left-hand side, you've got a linear pattern. We're going to call that sagittal, right? So if you're sagittal plane, you're in that linear bucket, because most of what we do, right? Yeah. And then on the other side of that continuum, we have what's called multi-planar, right? Which is 2 or more planes of motion, which should be of no, it shouldn't be confusing to the audience. So when you now overlap these 2 things, you have 4 quadrants.
Yeah.
So in essence, you have an upper left quadrant. So let's go through. Upper would be loaded. So that's external load. And then left would be loaded linear. Mm-hmm. So an example of a loaded linear is basically an external load in the sagittal plane, right? When our trunk and our limbs are mostly going in the sagittal plane.
Yeah.
And let's not overthink it at this point. So I'm going to use the example of a chest exercise. So a chest loaded linear would be bench press for this example, right? There could be many, many more, but that would, and then a back squat, a deadlift, most bodybuilder exercises are going to be loaded linear, no problem, right? We're going to talk about the advantages of that in a second. So there's all those examples. For the chest, it's a bench press. If I go down and I look at the bottom left quadrant, so now I'm unloaded of any external means, so it's my body weight, and it's linear, so it's in the sagittal plane. Well, a push-up, right? So, and these are basic examples.
Yeah.
So that would be an example of a chest exercise that's body weight driven, that's sagittal dominant, right? And in the sense that my trunk is moving in the sagittal plane. If I move over to the bottom right quadrant, that's unloaded multi-planar training, right? So UMT. An example of that would be my body weight in a multi-planar environment. If I'm chest, then I'm doing some sort of maybe, a Spider-Man or a gecko push-up, or, a push-up with rotation, or something that's going to elicit, a different response of more than just one plane of motion. And then the last one, the upper right, is loaded multi-planar. So an example there might be I'm standing up, I got a cable that is shoulder height, and I'm doing a rotational cable chest press.
Yeah.
So now it's not only chest, but my whole body is rotating. My thigh or my pelvis and my foot has to accommodate the transverse plane, as well as pushing this thing forward.
Yeah.
So if we look at that, if that's clear to the listener, we've got 4 quadrants, right? Loaded and unloaded, linear or multiplanar. And we've got an example of one body part in each of those quadrants. Now, instead of saying, bench press sucks or bench press is best, which is the ideological dogmatic, kind of sometimes the conversations that emerge.
Yeah.
What we would rather suggest is this. Hey, it elicits a response in the body.
Yeah.
What is that response? And do you want that for yourself or your client? If yes, well, then consider it. If no, well, then don't consider it. Pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
So a bench press, you could say, well, it's going to be hard on the shoulder. And I say, well, fine. But what does the bench press do? Well, if you can accommodate good scapulohumeral rhythm, if you get good arthrokinematics of the shoulder, and if you can accommodate that pattern, and that's not all you do, one thing that it does afford is the ability to go heavier.
Yeah.
And when we go heavier, based on Henneman's size principle, you go from type 1 fibers to type 2A and type 2B and type 2X fibers because of the load. Because it's linear. Like if it was more multiplanar, you have to reduce load, which may not access as many of those fibers unless you're moving it at speed. So there's other ways of doing it, but this is one in which it can elicit type 2 fibers. Well, type 2 fibers are prone to hypertrophy. So you get a greater cross-sectional area in that muscle. Well, a couple things happen. A greater cross-sectional area could mean more force potential. Like you can produce more force potentially. That's a cool thing if you want it. Greater cross-sectional area for perhaps, both genders, but certainly men, could be an aesthetic thing. Like I want a bigger chest so I look better, and I want to look better naked. Great. If that's what you want and you value that, and that's of high value to you, then if you value that, I value that, no judgments.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we judge that, it's vain, or you shouldn't do that, it's more functional, whatever. Like if you grew up chubby and, you always, and finally you want to look good, then that's your deal. Like no judgment on that at all.
Yeah.
And so that may be one way in which to get there. Okay, no problem. So that's the loaded linear. That's a benefit. Is there consequences? Well, sure. And we could talk about those if we want as well. The unloaded linear could be a push-up. So what is the benefit there? Well, equally to the chest, it'll work the chest musculature for the same reasons. I can maybe do it a little faster and more explosive. I can regress the pattern. But one thing that it does do is it's more closed chain, meaning my body is the mass that's moving, not my hands. So it's my body moving in a way towards and away from my hands. So it requires a lot more tonic-based stability mechanisms within the trunk, within the scapulothoracic region, within the glenohumeral region. There's more stability required. So, all right, there's a benefit to stability and shoulder mechanics and trunk mechanics. Okay, cool. There's a benefit. The gecko or the Spider-Man push-up is the same, but it's more omnidirectional, right? So if you look at the research on the shoulder joint, and they say mechanically, the shoulder recognizes 16,000 different positions in space.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who counts these things, but clearly PhD PTs do this, right?
Yeah.
And so, okay, if that's true, how many of those positions in the gym in traditional training do we expose our body to? And the answer would probably be not that many, because we do our front raises and we do our shoulder. In the classic vernacular of strength training, we don't do a lot of those 16,000 different positions. We may have 20 of them.
Yeah.
And so the value here is, okay, my unloaded multi-planar exercise for my chest, if you will, is my crawling, rotational, whatever push-up. I'm now getting more of my thorax into my scapula and my scapula into my humerus, more positions in my shoulder to create more tonicity and more type 1 motor control, and still working my chest. So if the name of the game is I want to do my bench press for longer and I want to have a career in doing that and not fizzle out, maybe I might want to do that unloaded multi-planar push-up. Why? Helps my shoulders.
Yeah.
Right? It bulletproofs my shoulders to do these other things. Great. And then the rotational standing one, right, which is the LMT, the loaded multi-planar.
Yeah.
There's foot action, the control. There's trunk rotation, right? There's still chest girdle. There's shoulder mechanics that are now more than in just the frontal plane. I'm actually getting a little bit more of my chest into the opposite side, external obliques, because that's sling, because I'm rotating.
Yeah.
So I'm tying the shoulder to the opposite hip, which is great for life, great for throwing in sport, great for mechanics, and great for integration. Might be great for calorie burn because I'm burning more calories, because the utilization of energy is higher because I'm getting more muscle mass going, whatever. So the point being here is that each of these quadrants offers a benefit.
Yeah.
The point now is not whether that is bad or good, like, oh no, functional, terrible, or linear, terrible because it's not functional. To us, we don't engage in those types of discussions, because to us, it's always, there's an input. Yeah. There is an input in each one of those. There's a benefit, and there's going to be an adaptive process in each one of those methodologies. Mm-hmm. How do we undulate that? How do we modulate and kind of consider those things? That's the art of program design. Yeah. But what we never do is throw out any of those considerations. Mm-hmm. Right? We may, when we stratify risk for an individual, that person has a shoulder impingement syndrome. Well, we're not going to do this particular exercise because it can't afford the rotation, whatever. So we might go through those patterns and assess whether that is good for the individual. Yeah. But as a general rule, we're not going to just throw it out because of an ideological viewpoint.
Yeah. And I love what you said about, whatever the goal is or the outcome that you're looking for that client wants, that's probably going to change where you put, like, you kind of move almost the buckets around a little bit. You change which ones they want filled, right? So yeah, if you have somebody who comes in and they want to look large and that's their main goal is, as you said, that vanity outcome, that aesthetic outcome, well, that's great. And so that's probably going to be the bucket where you're going to put most of your effort, but it doesn't mean you ignore the other three, right? We still have to make sure that we have all of that.
100%. We would call them movement vitamins, right? So you got your movement vitamins, right?
Yeah.
And if we're not suggesting that in these 4 quadrants, it's 25% each quadrant.
Yeah.
If you're a bodybuilder, I guarantee you'll want a high dose of loaded linear stuff.
Yeah.
Guaranteed. And you should, right? But if that's all you do, the question for you and I is, how do bodybuilders age? And as a cohort, where do they injure themselves?
Yeah.
Because, kind of success and failure leaves clues, right? So if I'm failing at, tendonitis, shoulder impingement, these are repetitive stress injuries, right? So how do you mitigate that? You bulletproof the body.
Yeah.
And I remember we were talking to a group that was with Phil Heath, Phil Heath, bodybuilder.
Yep.
And I don't think he's the reigning Mr. Olympia, but he's, super successful at the highest level bodybuilder. And what was cool about the team, the surrounding Phil Heath, is that he himself was looking at longevity. And he himself and his camp was looking at the 4Q in the sense that, hey, how can we actually think about this for Phil's longevity. Like, congratulations, man. If he loves to do bodybuilding and wants to do it, as he rides into the sunset, that is awesome for him.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as he wants to do it, the ability to do it is empowering.
Yeah.
So, good on him for considering those things. So, whoever it is, if they're a bodybuilder, they're going to have a high dosage of that quadrant. But to your point, if they ignore the other ones, I wouldn't say it's a ticking time bomb, but they're increasing the risk of potential injury.
Yeah.
And so what you would do is say, okay, prophylactically, we're going to put these other little vitamins in just to keep it bulletproof to do what you love to do.
Yeah.
So it might be I don't know what the percentages would be, but it might be hey, 85% in the LLT quadrant, and then distributing the other 3 quadrants for the other, 15 or 20%, whatever it is.
Yeah. And going back to like the benefits, because we'll talk about I think we talked about some of the drawbacks of sticking in only one quadrant. But when we're talking about things like the specifically multi-planar, whether it is a body weight or whether it's loaded, looking at sequencing, because you mentioned that in the linear unloaded, so like something like a push-up, your body, and now you're in closed chain, your body has to work a lot more on stability. And then once you start to add another plane of motion, your body has to think a lot more about sequencing of muscles and movements. And I think sequencing is one of those big pieces that a lot of people miss when they're thinking about variability. It's the actual sequencing of these muscles, and when are things turning on, how are things turning on, and understanding that every single time it does that, or you try to do the same movement, it's always different with regards to the pathways and the amount of sequencing, the timing of sequencing, but allowing your body to expand that I guess threshold of movement that you have to enable you to adjust to different variables. So we talked about ice earlier and walking on ice, but like slipping on ice, you don't realize it's there. You're walking down the street and all of a sudden your leg goes out. Does your body have the ability, the sequencing, the strength, and the tolerance in those tissues to be able to deal with that? Or are you going to either fall, or are you going to tear a muscle, an adductor, blow a hip, something like that in response to that? So I like that, the way that you put that 4Q.
And that's the idea, like multi-planar, well, linear too, but linear would be typically more simple neurologically. And that might be to our advantage. We're going to get Grandma Jones to do a simple task before she does a complex task. Pretty smart.
Yeah.
Right. But the idea is, if we can, from a tissue perspective and a motor perspective, allow the matriculation of that thought to flow within the 4 quadrants, then we're going to consider some other things.
Yeah.
And we would say that it's simple. It's not supposed to solve every problem, but what it is a simple first triage of consideration.
Yeah.
Because any exercise that's ever been done is somewhere in those 4Q, somewhere.
Yep. 100%.
Right? And if we can just say, okay, am I looking at my program from a distance? And if I do, if I'm stuck all in one quadrant, my next question is, do I want to be?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is yes, good. That's confirmation. Great. If it's not, then how do I rejig it so that it makes more sense to me?
Yeah.
Or I could have periodization. Now, many general clients never have periodization. I get it. And they don't need it. They just need something to keep them engaged and keep them moving forward along the adaptation pathway in ways that they want. So, the 4Q really gives us structured variability considerations.
Yeah, gives you that platform, that framework to be able to think about movement in a way that you maybe, because a lot of trainers who come in just think about, I have to memorize all these exercises. But if you can put it into a framework and just be like, okay, so I've got these types of tools that I can use, and I've got these quadrants that I can be able to, either move it linearly or multi-planar, I can load it or unload it. I can have any type of client in there and be able to get the adaptation that I'm seeking in that training program, and basically put them in the best position to not be injured and have success.
I like the way you framed that. I mean, it really is a way to categorize a lot of noise that is in the space. Yeah.
So I think it's also important for the listeners to understand as well that you can have more, in quotations, load or more force in a linear unloaded activity than you do in something that is loaded. So it's not necessarily a force thing, it's an external load thing.
Yeah, and that's a great clarifying point, is that when we say loaded to unloaded, we're only talking about referencing external load to the body, but we're not talking at all about force. So let me give an example. If I was to do depth jumps off of a block, whatever it is, like let's say a 6-inch or 20 centimeter block, and I'm landing on one leg decelerating, the amount of force that's going through my system is what it is, right? It'll be a multiple of my body weight for sure. So that would be considered unloaded, but the difference is it's unloaded, but it's in a different space within those quadrants. And this is a little bit more advanced, but it's still unloaded, right?
Yeah.
The purpose of this discussion, it's unloaded. A 5-pound back squat would be considered loaded.
Yeah.
Now, nobody out there would argue that a 5-pound back squat is more load to the body than a single leg depth jump deceleration.
Yeah.
So yes, that point is awesome to clarify. We are talking nothing about force. We are only talking about a reference point to external load to our bodies, right? And what it does do, again, as a first triage, is it allows us to consider, weights in the gym, or free weights or bands, or versus the body weight athlete, which is, whether it's animal flow, whether it's parkour, whether it's gymnastics, or any of the human flags, or anything of the body weight athlete that is out there. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And those typically fit in the body weight category, which is our unloaded category. And they typically all require more joint stability, because you are your own loading mechanism at that point.
Yeah.
So therefore you got to stabilize, right? It's like relative strength versus max strength.
Yeah.
Relative strength is you, right? So a rock climber is going to have more joint stability than me going into the gym and doing lat pull downs every 10th day.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah. It's a great way to simplify the way of thinking, but also allow you to expand out from maybe the constructs that you have already. So I really want to get into this because, as I said, I listened to a podcast of yours, and it ended with you starting to talk about metabolic flexibility. And this is like, and you prefaced it so well, and it got me so excited, and then it had to end. And you were like, this is, people are going to be talking about this. Pardon?
It's a cliffhanger. It might've been on purpose. I add the cliffhanger. It's like the movies that have the cliffhanger at the end.
Yeah.
We're going to say that. Oh, we're not going to say it.
Yeah. Yeah. It was fantastic. Cause I was like, oh, this is, we look at, you talked about fashion and fitness having trends, and it's all driven by trends. And, we've seen everything from Bosu balls and stability balls and, CrossFit, I guess, maybe you could call that a trend, or maybe just a different way or type of training. You had a whole bunch of different things. And then you're like, yeah, this is a trend of the future. Like, if you haven't heard about this, or they're not talking about this right now, they're going to be talking about this, in the next few years, and it's going to be a big thing. Can you give us what is metabolic flexibility? And then can you kind of bring it into that 4-quadrant model for us?
Yeah, I can. So metabolic flexibility is a term that's used in research. Another way of saying it that we might exchange right now relative to what we're talking about is metabolic variability, right? But let's stick to metabolic flexibility for now. It's really how flexible can a person be, can an organism be at switching from one fuel source to the next with ease. Now, the complexities of metabolism are many. They involve a bunch of chemistry, right? Chemical reactions. They involve a bunch of catalyzing agents within different steps of energy system utility. They involve rate limiting steps. They involve some fatigue byproducts that are created that, inhibit certain things. So there's all these complexities. But to simplify it for a second, if you and I had a car, we were a car, let's say, that ran on predominantly 3 fuel sources, right? We would want to express those fuel sources from time to time, all of them, right? In order to be healthy, in order to run well, we'd have to express all of those fuel sources to be basically bulletproof. We talked about this idea of variability. Like, remember, the loss of adaptability equals functional impairment, which leads to death, right?
Yeah.
So the loss of adaptability means you're real good at one substrate or one pathway, may not be so good at the other pathway. And so metabolic flexibility speaks to this. It speaks to the ability for our bodies to shift from one fuel source to the next with ease. Now, the listener out there could be thinking, well, that seems pretty logical and that seems pretty inherent within the body. Why wouldn't the body do it normally anyway? Right? Just as a natural function of just, mechanisms of an organization of biology. And it does to a certain point, but it's how we train also influences that. Right? So if we're now, obviously the trend of the day is high intensity.
Yeah.
And what they call it is HIIT, which is high intensity interval training. As we're about to see, I'm going to put that in question. Like, is it really HIIT training that we're doing? I wouldn't dispute that it's high intensity, but the interval is predicated on the idea that there is a work to rest ratio that makes sense to recover.
Yeah.
Right. And in HIIT training protocols right now, in today's gym or today's fitness arena, I would argue that there's not a lot of recovery. What's taking, what's being held hostage is recovery, right? They're just shortening recovery bouts, which is fine, but it's really not HIIT training after a while. And so the idea of using different substrates and the ease with which we can use different substrates, different fuel, makes us better as a machine, right? Or a human entity or a biological structure. So that, in its broadest definition, is what metabolic flexibility is. What lies underneath that is a bunch of different nuance. So let me scratch one layer beyond that for a second. So, we're fraught with sound bites in our industry, right? And one of the sound bites is, don't do aerobic exercise because it kills our gains. Yeah. Right. And what that's driven into is, it is correct, but it's also, it's out of context. Yeah. Right. So that statement is factually correct, but there's no context to it. So if we're going to do aerobic exercise, it's going to interfere with a signaling pathway that makes us grow. Yeah. But there's a timestamp to that too, right? Like if we're doing concurrent training and you're saying, okay, well, let's wait 6 or 7 or 8 hours before we do a cardio. Well, then you're pretty safe at that point. Like, there's not a lot of interference that happens after that point. Right. So the idea of just performance, like if we just put our performance hat on, is concurrent training. You want to separate them with enough time in between, so you basically have no interference. Right. So you can maximize your gains. Part of the health, because we're a health and human performance company, part of the health expression would be, why wouldn't you want interference? Because if you had interference, what would your body have to do? It would have to adapt to that. Yeah. Like, there's interference. Hey, body, now what? You got to adapt. Yeah. Because life is interference, right? That's all it is, right? And there's competing interests of chemistry. Like, there's all sorts of different things, right? Yeah. So the health part of that discussion would be, why wouldn't you, at a phase of your training, want interference? Like, get it. And then get your body to have to deal with it, because that makes you unbreakable. Yeah. Right. So let's back up. So if aerobic exercise kills your gains, then unfortunately what comes of that soundbite is what, Adam? Well, no one never does any cardio, right? Or aerobic efforts, right? Because it's going to kill your gains. Well, that doesn't sound right, because, recovery largely is about oxygen. And if I can increase my capacity to deliver, transport, deliver, and utilize oxygen in the body, well, that's a pretty good deal. And that's going to be really expressed in aerobic means. Right. And so I kind of want to do that. Then there's this idea that, well, you never want to burn proteins as fuel, because that's the performance hat. But if you put your health hat on, you'd say, well, why not? They'd say, because you're killing your gains. And you'd say, really? Like, going through oxidative transamination and deamination, which is basically proteins into the Krebs cycle, to the degree that you're burning proteins or burning your muscle, is not that great. However, expressing oxidative transamination and deamination with all of the catalyzing enzymes that require that to enter the Krebs cycle is awesome. Why? Because that makes a person ready for that fuel source and more physiologically ready for any perturbation. Yeah. Which means they're ready for any stressor, because nothing's going to phase them. They can burn proteins when needed. They can burn fat because they've expressed that. And I would argue that what you lose, the little bit that you burn in terms of muscle, you capture in more readiness so that you can actually challenge the system more and stress it more and make better gains. Does that make logical sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that to me is like, why are you worried about that? Right? Because if you're a healthy system that is ready, then you can stress it and then you can recover, stress it again, recover. And that is where you make, your long-term gains, because you're equally indexing towards high performance or human performance and health. And that's what we're looking at all the time. We're an applied health and human performance company, right? So that's what we're looking at all the time.
Yeah.
And so with that metabolic flexibility, we have a 4Q for it. And that 4Q speaks to the same idea. So think about the same in your mind's eye. Think about a y-axis and an x-axis again, but this time it's not a plus sign, not a plus sign. It's more of a cross. So we take that x-axis and we move it up. And as you might tell already, as we move it up, that's relative to anaerobic threshold or ventilatory threshold, right? It's going to be higher up for most folks. It's going to be higher up as a percent of their heart rate, right, relative to max, in terms of when they cross the threshold. And that threshold for us, it's the point at which we're predominantly utilizing sugars as fuel and not other things. Like we're not really going into the Krebs citric acid cycling. Yeah. It's just more immediate fuels through glycolysis. So if we're looking at that, cool. That's our x-axis. That's the dividing line between over threshold and under threshold. So if we look at the y-axis for a second, the up and down, that is basically intensity. Even say as a measure of heart rate, if you want, right? It's intensity. There's high intensity on the top, and there's submaximal or low intensity as we go down. Yeah. So that is your y-axis right here. Your x-axis is on the left, you got steady state, and on the right, you get interval. And we don't necessarily mean steady state and interval as in time. Like, oh, I took a break and the stopwatch came on again. That's a time interval. We're talking about a physiological steady state or a physiological interval, meaning you got to see some sort of change in physiology. If you don't, it's steady state. And if you do, it's interval. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So if we have those two things in our mind's eye, we got high intensity and submaximal intensity. We got steady state and we got interval. All right. So let's plot our quadrants now. The lower left quadrant is submaximal intensity, steady state, which we call SISS, S-I-S-S, submaximal intensity, steady state, S-I-S-S. And SISS would be, LSD training, right? It would be aerobic training. And what does that do? It increases hemoglobin, increases myoglobin. It expresses PGC1 alpha, PGC4 alpha, AMPK. All of these things are aerobic things that add to longevity and recovery, right? As well as just better aerobic processes, because I can just, be a better aerobic being. Now, there's a point of overdose there, right? And we've seen a lot with high-level endurance athletes. So there's too much of a good thing. But, one could argue that there's a lot of good benefit to that quadrant, right? Just like the 4Q neuromechanical, there's benefits to each quadrant. Yeah. So there's SISS, there's benefit to there. If we move over one quadrant to the lower right, we'd say that is submaximal intensity interval training, SIIT. And so that's submaximal, but there's a physiological interval. So it comes up and down in terms of intensity, but always below threshold. So what we could argue is that's activities, an example of would be activities of daily living, right? Activities of daily living typically are submax and they're undulating, right? You change if you're gardening or doing chores, your heart rate goes up a little bit and then it comes down, goes up a little bit, but it never really crosses. You never induce acidosis when you're doing gardening or navigating your day with chores. So that's SIIT. What's the value of that, right? NEAT, right? Non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and everything that goes with that in terms of health outcomes, right? Every comorbidity is going to be influenced in a positive way by increasing, activities of daily living, right? And so SIIT is another good one for longevity, right? Never been studied in performance, but it is the most important in terms of health, right? So that thing there is the health one. Then you go up a quadrant. So the upper right-hand quadrant is high intensity interval training. And so us, that would be true physiological recovery, not just a time like 15 seconds to go again. And for that, as we know, it's a 1-to-4 or 1-to-6 ratio between work and rest. If you're looking at metabolic recovery or nervous system recovery. So metabolic recovery, typically 1-to-4. So if I do something all out for 20 or 30 seconds, I'm going to take somewhere around 2 minutes to get my substrate or my energy systems back. I can get 3.5 back in about 60 seconds or so, but I might take another minute to get the last bit back, and then I can create critical power again and go right up to red line, critical power, and then I recover for 4 minutes, and then I do it again. Example is this: an Olympic weightlifter, right, will do, let's say, near max loads, not max, but they might do 1, 2, or 3 hang snatches, high intensity. Then they drop the bar and they talk to their coach for the next 5 minutes or 6 minutes while they chalk their hands. We would argue that is awesome HIIT training, because that is HIIT training. They're not going to do it again in 30 seconds because they're doing an EMOM, right? It's not that. It's not designed to be that. That's HIIT training. Why are they taking that much recovery and chalking their hands? Because they need full recovery again to go to critical power again, because critical power for them is the biggest determinant of success. So I would argue that HIIT training is a lost art nowadays, because it's replaced with what we're going to call HISS training, which is the upper left quadrant, high intensity, steady state. Now, let me time out there. Some of the listeners are going to say, wait a minute, Michol, you cannot be high intensity and steady state. It's impossible. And you're right. For long periods of time, you can't. But for short bouts, you can. And for functional, high intensity functional training, you can, if you undulate upper and lower body, because you're getting autocrine and localized fatigue that can be modulated upper and lower. So there is a way to actually get more high intensity for longer, and some studies up to 12 minutes by undulating certain things. And I mean over threshold for 12 minutes, right? Which doesn't make sense to our exercise physiology hats, right? Because you'd say, you can't buffer fatigue that fast, and your OBLA is being, expressed. You can't do all those things, right? Yeah. But you can in certain contexts. So high intensity, steady state. Let me define that. High intensity is over threshold. Steady state means your body does not have enough recovery to get back to a different level of physiology. Therefore, your physiology is more steady state. So an example of this would be everything that was being done in high intensity exercise right now. EMOMs, AMRAPs, ASAPs, Tabatas. These are all, in our view, HISS. And HISS training is awesome, and it also has consequence, right? Yeah. So your CrossFit community, as you mentioned before, to a large degree is expressing HISS. Now, what is a byproduct of a lot of HISS when recovery is not there, or it's not there long enough, is a steady state physiology, which means I'm now producing and accumulating fatigue. That fatigue is lactic acid dissociating into a hydrogen and a lactate anion and ion, right? So a hydrogen ion plus charge and a lactate anion negative charge. Yeah. What's being produced because it dissociates in water, and we're mostly water. So lactate can be reused through gluconeogenesis in the liver. And hydrogen ion is the one that is typically the culprit, unless there's an adaptive process like a Himalayan, which we won't get into today. But they can use hydrogen as a fuel, which is weird. But hydrogen ion competes with calcium at troponin. It inhibits muscle contraction, and that's the fatigue, right? So we either have to buffer it, efflux it, or deal with it somehow. But as it accumulates, and as we get acidosis, growth hormones are now produced from glands in the body because of that acidosis. Then they're first messengers in the blood. They bind to a receptor. They send a second messenger into the cell to make that cell grow. No wonder it's popular nowadays, because if you look at the CrossFit community, if you look at the high intensity community at large, they're all jacked. Yep. And so they're thinking, great, I want that too. Fantastic. The consequence, though, is more insidious, right? It may be more immediate long-term, right? It may not be right away. So that intermediate and long-term could echo itself. And then there's also the idea of expressing intensity long-term, which is, you're burning your engine hot all the time. Your engine's going to wear out. And that is through what's called mTOR. And mTOR is a pathway, a growth pathway. And if we express that a lot, it's linked to a decreased lifespan. So now again, we've got our health and human performance hat. The human performance hat would say, that makes me bigger, stronger, faster. Me like, give me 3 of those, right? Or give me a lot of dose of that his stuff. And okay, cool. That's the human performance side. But the health side would say, you don't want that, right?
Yeah.
You don't want that too much, because too much of that creates autophagy and it creates protein turnover, and it's linked with a decreased lifespan.
Yeah.
So what do you want, right? And then it's a matter of not saying yes or no, like that's bad and that's good. It's like, no, I do that too, but I just monitor the dose and I look at the 4 quadrants of the metabolic 4Q. And then I ask myself, what kind of metabolic flexibility do I want relative to my goal and my physiological readiness?
Yeah. So when you're looking at that, is it specifically the high intensity where you're looking at the protein substrates then coming in and being a part of that? Or are you talking about that more with the lower intensity steady state with some resistance training?
It's going to be 2 things. It's either going to be during the recovery phase of your high intensity stuff, or it's going to be during submaximal stuff.
Yeah.
Because the only way you can get proteins as fuels is via the Krebs cycle through oxidative transamination and deamination.
Yeah.
And that's where you're starting to cleave off, fatty beta oxidation, same thing. Like it needs the Krebs citric acid cycle to do it.
Yeah.
Which, as you know, it's highly aerobic, right?
Yeah.
So, you're going to get aerobic when you're recovering, or you're going to get aerobic during aerobic exercise. And that's where you get it. And so I understand the fear, because everybody's consumed with, can't lose my gains, and I can't lose my muscle mass. And I think, the way in which we can approach that should be more measured than that soundbite, in my opinion. Right? Yeah. Because there's more than going on. Like, yeah, you're going to burn proteins, but you're not going to be net negative necessarily. Right? If you're expressing a lot of other things and you're, working on resistance training, you're working on intensity, then you're good. And if you're not necessarily, if you're doing concurrent training with a time gap that's big enough, you're not really going to interfere with the mTOR pathway.
Yeah.
And so there's ways around that. And it's not, your body is not so rigid that it just utilizes those means and then the consequences are fixed. Meaning I burned some protein in the crab, therefore I can never build protein again. Like it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And I think if you have proper nutrition and nutrient timing, the amount of protein going into that cycle versus the amount of protein that your body can then can still use to, repair the tissues, right?
That's exactly right. You're exactly correct. I mean, that's a consideration too. And then you've got, cumulative, chronic stress, chronic inflammation versus acute. Then you've got, just sleep parameters. So you've got your lifestyle parameters as well. Yeah. All of this thing is stuck in the milieu called biology.
Yeah. And I think it's important to know that there's a lot of people who they're very fixed on one category, whether it be bodybuilding or it's all functional or it's this or it's that. And it's the same in cardio, it's the same in flexibility, it's the same in resistance training, it's the same in all of those categories. And just understanding that there is merit and a purpose to every single one of those. And it has to be married to the adaptation that you and or your client are looking for and what is needed or most important. So wants versus needs with regards to health versus performance. And I think that's important to.
Yeah, I think those perspectives are good. I appreciate you, restating them, because it does need restating. There is a person's goals matters. What their value set is matters. What their readiness physiologically is matters. And then the idea of sustainability. Do you want to continue to do what you love to do?
Yeah.
Great. Right. That matters too. Right. So the idea of health and human performance, not health or human performance. Because a lot of times I think we naturally make the mistake of thinking that fitness equals health. And it doesn't, right? Our ethos is fitness does not necessarily equal health. And there's a lot of people that have written that athletes are not healthy. And, there's truth in that statement, right? Not categorical, but there is truth in that statement. There's a lot of athletes that are just not sustainable. And they were bigger, stronger, faster in their 20s and 30s. And how many times have we heard this? And they're broken at 40.
Yeah.
Well, That's no good, right? Because now you can't enjoy your life. Like that's terrible, right? So that's always what we look at. Can we modulate between health and human performance and consider both of those?
Yeah. And I think with new trainers, really emphasizing that in the initial consult that you have with a client, when you're first talking with them, one of the best things that you can do as a trainer is help them understand, have that 30,000-foot view that looks outside of the immediacy, because they're in that environment, they're living their life, right? They know what they feel and what they want, but being able to take all of the assessments that you've done and be able to kind of tease out, okay, what are the needs of this client and how can I meld together the wants and needs together so that I, as you guys do very well, is look at both the health and the performance side of things.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to wrap up here. So I have kind of a lightning round, 3 questions, which I sent you. And I'm always very fascinated with the responses that I get. So I'm ready to write some answers. So let's start with number 1. Top 3 books on any topic that you've read. Fiction, nonfiction, doesn't matter.
I'm a big nonfiction guy. I'm a big textbook guy, and I'm a big like um, you know like biography guy.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to know about what made an individual who they were, and I like text. I like freestanding research as well. Although I like textbook because it typically consolidates it into a better narrative
Mm-hmm.
than a here's what we tested, here's what we got. Although that's cool too. So I very rarely read fiction. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's almost always nonfiction. So in terms of top 3, I don't know. I mean that's a difficult one for me. I would just say that for me, biographies and kind of academia or textbooks is really what cranks me out. I will also say this, that when I read, I typically read slow.
Yeah.
And that kind of goes contrary to the absorb information fast and fast learning and everything else. And I appreciate that. But to me, it doesn't work. I typically read slow and reflect. And that's my time to really go slow and to turn actually things down, because what I'm able to keep is far better than trying to assimilate a ton of information and losing it because I'm filling the bucket, but there's 17 holes that are draining because I'm just losing it on the tail end. I would rather slow the fill of my bucket and really contemplate and think, and then write. And often I'm with a textbook and I'm writing things down, or I don't like to do technology because I can't write stuff. I suppose you could, like in the margins you've got, but I like to actually write on the margins and put diagrams in. And I know you can do that on tech too, but I just prefer the physicality of actually cursively writing it down.
Mm-hmm.
And so I slow myself down. Those are moments for me where life is fast already. It's like, I'm going to slow this way down and actually slow learn.
Yeah.
And think and contemplate and ask questions and write, curious statements. And, that's me.
Yeah. And it's actually really, I'm very like the exact same way. I don't know if I could speed myself up to read if I wanted to. So
my daughter reads faster than me.
Oh man. My wife will finish a chapter before I finish like a page and a half of a book, because me, like you, I'm a slow reader and I'd like to be able to read faster so I can absorb more information quicker. But the same as you, like I like to take notes. I like to highlight. I like to underline. I like to like I got a notebook that sits beside me as I'm reading a text, and I'll sit there, underline something, and then I'll write some notes about kind of how I would apply that, or what that would pertain to maybe in a course that we have, or we're designing a new one. So I'm very, very similar with that. The way that I've started to marry, because I've read how to I guess watch some videos about how to read faster, but you're just skimming, like you're not pulling in any information. So for something that's fiction, that's great.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But for something that's that's not a great way to go about doing that. So something that I've actually done is, if it's available on something like Audible or something else, I'll actually purchase it there. I'll have the physical text and I'll play it, like, because audibly I'm really good at learning, taking notes as somebody's going, and I can pause it, underline where I'm at, and I follow along with the words because it can talk faster than I can read.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah. All right. So top 3 mentors in your journey thus far.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm like a politician. I'm vague here. I like, well, here's the thing. I try to seek lessons in a lot of things. That's just me, right?
Yeah.
So I always look at individuals or experiences as being teachers or teaching moments, right? So, for me, mentors are teachers. And I'm thinking, well, what are the top three? That's a good question. But how do I answer that question? Because in certain contests, I look at my dog who's laying beside me right now, and he's taught me more than most humans in certain ways, right? And then having a daughter as a father has taught me certain things that I couldn't have learned anywhere else. Like even communicating to my daughter who's going just into grade 4 now,
Mm-hmm.
about just navigating being a girl and then being a woman, right? I don't have experience to that, but having her interact with me and having a father begin to appreciate that to a whole new level, right? And she's going in, she's going to be 10, she'll be 12 and 14 soon, and she'll have her physiology change, right? And what even in that experience, like, and talking to her about a menstrual cycle and what that actually is, and I've engaged in that conversation with her in a very clear, very comfortable way.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, that has taught me more about interacting with youngsters than anything else, because it wasn't what I said, it was how I said it. In other words, if dad's comfortable with this, maybe I can be comfortable with it too.
Yeah.
And if dad's speaking directly to the questions I am asking him and answering directly, right,
Yeah.
then maybe I'm okay with this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a valuable lesson to me, because in looking at this, often it's like, well, we don't want to talk about those types of things, whether it's, sex or let's say periods or anything like that. And then where do they learn it? On the schoolyard?
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, well, I don't know if that's better. So I remember distinctly, she was in the backseat of the car 2 years ago. She was 8, right? So imagine an 8-year-old child, right? And she goes, Dad, what's the difference between boys and girls? And I'm thinking, hey, today's the day we're going to have this talk, right? I'm like, we're in the friend driving, right? And so I promised myself whatever question she asked, I would give her a direct answer. So she asked, she said, I've heard about a period. And I said, well, you've got, a uterus, which is a sac in your stomach that boys don't have.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, that will establish a lining, which is this, this lining, this epithelial lining. And she goes, okay. And it will shed every 28 days and it'll come out of your vagina as blood. Now, how direct of an answer is that to a direct question? It is super direct. And I said, and every time she asked a follow-up question, I'd say, Brooke, that's an awesome question. Here's the answer.
Yeah.
And that's an awesome question. Here's the answer. So now we're into that process, Adam.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, wow, she's still asking questions and I'm answering every one.
Yeah.
She hugs me and she said, Dad, shouldn't I be talking to Mom about this? I'm like, probably, because she has experience. But I said, anytime you want to talk to Dad, I'm happy to engage in that discussion.
Yeah.
And she said, I want to talk to you about it again. I said, anytime. And she goes, I love you so much. And she was comfortable with this. And from that discussion back 2 years ago, we have a whole game plan. Like she knows exactly what she's going to be doing when she gets to school and she has her period.
Yeah.
So, not to get off topic, but that's been a teaching moment for me. Right. Yeah. And that's been a valuable teacher for me. So I look for those opportunities in life.
Yeah. Yeah. The experience of walking through it and irrespective of who it is. And I don't have kids. I actually had a podcast with Farrell Huruska, who I know from kind of the idea scene and being in San Diego where she is. We had a discussion about that and having those conversations all about women in training and those different discussions that occur at different points. But I love the idea of just being direct. Oftentimes parents will defer to the parent who knows more about that, right? So as a male, you have your daughter come and ask you that. Often you're like, oh, that's probably a conversation you should go have with your mother, right?
Or you talk childish and baby talk. And when you do is you subvert the power with which you can give children, you can empower them.
Yeah.
Right? Because they'll see right through that. Like if I'm skirting the issue and I'm uncomfortable, all they're going to see is Dad's uncomfortable, therefore I should be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right? Which does not help them.
Yeah. And with the way you answer questions and really just confirm that the question was a good question, you're fostering as your company, that you're fostering that curiosity and wanting to ask questions and actually get good answers.
Every time.
Yeah. That's awesome. All right. So what would Michol of today tell 20-year-old Michol?
Well, since I'm 25 right now, that'd be 5-year-old Michol. But yeah, so that would be kind of, later 20s for me, right? 20 years ago. So, I've moved from Alberta, Canada, to San Diego, California, and I was always enamored with water, always have been and still am. And I'm fortunate enough to live about 2 blocks away from the ocean, which is just that way.
Yeah.
And here in San Diego, good waves, good surf, right? And so as soon as I got here, I was 33 at the time when I moved down here. And I was the guy that was learning surfing real late in life, and that's it's a pretty slow learning curve, right? It takes a while. And but I was happy on my board, and I took a lot of the philosophy of just surfing in general. So I'm gonna answer that good question by using a surfing analogy, which is really about what do surfers do. Like if you look at surfing in general, it doesn't come when you want it, right? The waves just don't come they just come when they come. And so it requires patience, right? Like you have to wait for the swell to hit before you go out there. And often what happens is, and that's a metaphor for life. So in one of the senses, I'd say, Michol, you got to wait for it, right? And that's easy to say, and it's cliche to say. Like I'm saying this and everybody's saying, I got it. Wait for it. But internalize that. Like you got to wait for it,
yeah.
Right? And sometimes waiting for it could be 5 years, 10 years, right? And a lot of times, people give up right before, right? And so are you prepared to wait for it? And I don't mean wait like in a day. I mean, 5 years. Are you ready? If you're prepared to lean into your craft for 10 years, for 15 years, for 5 years, whatever that, is that process something in your barometer? Like, is that calibrated in that time code? Or is it, I'm going to wait for 3 months, and if I don't get success, I'm out of here. Yeah. Life doesn't necessarily operate that way. Right. And so patience is something that in the immediacy of, gratifications that are immediate in our world now is a lost art. So patient, like true patience, like things will come in their own time. Yeah. So I would have told myself, and that would be a piece of advice I would have told myself back then related to the surfing experience. The other thing that's interesting about surfing is that if ever you've done it, you go out there, and if you're in the impact zone, like the sea doesn't want you in there. So the waves are just like smacking you to shore, and you're fighting your way through the churn of the water, and you're fighting. And what's interesting is it could be 20 feet or, whatever that is, like 3 meters, the distance between fighting. And if you get past that last wave, it's like so calm and so relaxed. And the distance is like 10, 20 feet. Yeah. And the point of like churn to the point of like, I'm just going to relax on my board and just let the swell kind of rock me to sleep. The difference is like so minute, right? If you're caught inside versus if you make it past that outside set, right? So that's another metaphor for life, is that sometimes the difference between, feeling a flow and chaos could be closer than you think, which means sometimes just lean into it a little bit more. Fight your way past it, and you'll be at this point of rhythm, which is the swell, as opposed to the chaos and the churn of the whitewash. And that distance is not that far, right? When you look at it, and it's amazing the difference between the churn and the calmness of the swell. And so that's another metaphor that surfing would teach me that I could, say to my, my former self, right? And then the other one too is a lot of times surfers will just look at waves. They'll just go and I remember being in the North Shore of Hawaii at Bonsai Pipeline, right? And the first thing you notice is that there's massive waves dumping pretty close to shore. And every time they dump, you can feel the earth shake underneath you. It's really weird. And they're big wave, like 20 footers just bam, bombing down. And you see surfers not that far away from you. The next thing you notice is that beautiful, pristine beach, North Shore, Hawaii, right? Oahu. Beautiful, pristine beach, 0 people laying on the beach, right? Nobody's laying on the beach. Like everybody is, and there might be 300 people standing on the beach looking at the ocean. And that's another thing that surfing taught me, is to be mindful, to take into something. Like we talked about mindful reading, just slowing down. Can you just slow down? And again, that's easy to say, like just be mindful. It almost becomes cliche, right? But mindfulness is about bringing attention towards intention. right? So if you look at and unpack that, you can be mindful as you eat your chocolate cake. Like, this is the best bite of deliciousness I've ever had, whatever, right? Whatever you are bringing attention towards and your intention towards whatever it is, that's mindfulness.
Yeah.
Right? So if folks are looking at the wave, they're not just like, that's a cool wave. They're like looking at the wave and they're feeling it and they're looking at the surfers in the wave, and they are to the point where they're not even laying down. They're mindful about that experience.
Yeah.
So, going through the experience of life is something that when we're young, we don't, I think, have a calibrated thought towards. Like, we're just going through the motions, and I want to get to the next thing. I want to achieve my next thing. I'm looking ahead. And that's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But taking moments to be mindful about, let me just, be in this moment right now and appreciate it for what it is. And that could be petting a dog. It could be playing with your kids. That could be eating your favorite dessert. It could be whatever you want to do. But I think that to me is something that resonates with me more now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's awesome. I didn't ask for 3, but that's awesome that all of those learned from surfing. Yeah. That's good.
I'm teasing.
No, I love that too, because when you look at children to adolescents to, late teens, early adulthood, right? There's always something to look for. There's always something next. And I agree. There's this point in life where you're like, all right, what's next after this? Let's enjoy now. Right? Like, when you're young, you're just looking to you want to get to school, you want to walk, you want to do all those things, you want to play sports, and everything's like, as you said, it's immediacy. It's wanting that instant gratification, and everything's like, I want to do what my older siblings doing or what my parents are doing. or my friends are doing. And then you get into university. It's like, I just want to finish university to get a job. And then once you get a job, I just want to get a job so I can get a house and then have a family. And then it's step. And then you get to a point. It's like, okay, there's still steps you can take. There's still things that you can do, but it's not like this set thing. It's almost like it now requires planning and patience and getting through, that storm before the calm that you talked about, right? Getting through that whitewash and then, just kind of settling and slowing everything down. And I think that's one thing for me, that would be one big thing that I would tell 20-year-old self as well, is just like, take it easy. Like, it's going to come when it comes. It's like, everything is about time. You won't get this back, because you look back and like those years, younger years, went by so fast, and you're like, where did all this time go? Because I tell everybody, I'm like, I would go back to high school and do all high school again. I would go back to university and do all university again, because I felt like it went by way too fast. Right. But,
yeah.
Well, I was gonna say, I don't have any more space to write anything. You saw me kind of like I'm on like the margins of sheets of paper here, trying to write notes. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and really sharing with myself and the audience. Like, I learned a lot, so I know that the audience will also learn a lot as well. But before we head out, can you just, I know you have the Applied Health and Human Performance Specialist that you just launched recently virtually. So can you just tell us a bit about that and what other stuff that you have kind of coming in the pipelines?
Yeah. So, as I said, IOM is really an applied health and human performance company. So we point that at fitness, we point that at healthcare, and we point that at performance. And by performance, we might mean elite performance, or we might be an executive performance, right? Yeah. So any type of sustained high level of outcome. Healthcare, we're not on the medical side. We are on the prevention side of the ledger, but that's healthcare for us. So we point those strategies in that domain as well. And then fitness and health would be the other one. So what we've done as of late is we put a credentialing together on health and human performance. And so what it is, as you mentioned, is an AHHPS, right? An Applied Health and Human Performance Specialist. And it's a leveling course, but we've just launched level 1 2 weeks ago, and it's online. And what was interesting about that, real quick, is we had a bunch of folks lean in. We had 319 students reach in our first wave.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about that group is that, often they said, Michol, what's interesting is as the industry is speaking about dumbbells and sets, you're talking about health, sustainability, and, outcomes of performance, which to that person was just on a different level, not a better level, just on a different level.
Yeah.
And so what we found is that there is a huge appetite for knowledge and programming experience around both health and human performance, because they don't necessarily mesh all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that dropped. We're doing another wave here right away, wave 2, and then that'll matriculate into a level 2 and a level 3. But if for those that want information on that, on the AHHPS program, they can go to www.instituteofmotion.com. And on that page, you can see all the information. Yeah. And so the level 1 is a 12-week curriculum, and they get access to our LMS, our learning management system, which is week by week. And then they get access to our program builder, which is not a workout builder, it's a program builder. So in that, implicit within that, they'll be able to design programs that have all 3 4Q models in it. Right. Mm-hmm. So they're going to start to develop programs and then save those programs as their own, and, distribute those programs, coach those programs, sell those programs to various different audiences that they want to touch. Awesome. So that's the one piece. And then the product piece, if they go to ViPR.com, ViPR.com, there you can learn all things about ViPR, which is our product that is really about, load-based, resistance-based, and movement-based elements, right? So it harkens back to the farm kid analogy. It's like taking the farm kid style of training in the gym.
Yeah. Yeah. If you haven't, for those listening, if you haven't either been to a conference and experienced the ViPR, or been to either a gym, a studio, or even watched a video about how to use the ViPR, there's a lot of stuff. You guys have a lot of great videos online. I know Jan's he's got a lot of stuff he does with ViPR and just body weight movements as well. And then you guys have an app too, correct?
We do, yeah. So if you go into Platform by IOM on the App Store or Google Play, then you can find it there and you can download it.
Yeah. Yeah. But an awesome tool, awesome information. So once again, thanks again for coming on. I had a great time, and I look forward to chatting again.
Yeah. Listen, Adam, I appreciate you taking the time to, investigate these discussions with various different individuals and engaging in a substantive way with a good spirit and, and a good perspective on things. And I think that begins to tilt a little bit of how we discuss and how we share best practices. And, you're a multiplier for that. So, I think we appreciate that as an industry, because, having that spirit with which you engage and want to expose information out there allows us to help more folks. And so, that is a multiplier that is needed. So we appreciate you for that too.
Well, thanks. I'm really happy to do it. We'll talk soon.
You bet.
State of the Industry Podcast.
I'll be back.